Hello, everybody. I want to start this particular message out with the right tone because the subject can be a difficult one, and if it's not set up probably in the proper way, it could possibly come across as anywhere from unfeeling to flippant. But I feel it's an important area to look at. So I want to make sure that anything that is said and the way that is said is hopefully not taken personally or aimed at circumstances within your storyline that may or may not be parallel or in line with what's going to be discussed. And the reason this is such a sensitive topic is because the topic is failure. And failure in our lives, in our conditioning, in our upbringing sometimes, and certainly within our culture, has a very distinct hue, a very distinct way that it is taken both by the individual and also by the community at large. That in and of itself makes failure, be they personal, be they group failure, be they national failure, or even in some instances global failure, a very ripe area to investigate, to see what that word actually means and where those sentiments actually come from. What is judged as a failure and why is it judged to be that way, and why are reactions to failure in and of themselves so distinct, so caustic, and so powerful to those at whom it is levied, even if the title of failure is being levied by yourself on yourself. The first thing to look at when it comes to failure is the fact that it is a judgment. We need to get that out of the way right from the start. Not only is it a judgment, I would call it a judgment that is at all times partially qualifiable. Let me describe what I mean by this. Partially qualifiable means that the items being utilized to characterize a failure, or to characterize someone as a failure, or someone's actions as a failure, no matter how distinct, no matter how well backed up or litigated to prove the point that it or he or she or they are a failure or have failed at something, a task, an ideal, an occupation. At all points, just like with any judgment, just like with any critique, just like with any accusation of that nature, regardless of how strong the evidence might be, you must realize that all evidence, in particular when it comes to failure, especially in this way that we are looking at it, will always be incomplete. And it will always be incomplete because within the storyline, you're never going to have the complete picture. You're never going to be able to have the full picture. You can only work on the information that you have within what's arising in front of you, within the storyline, within your life, within the lives of others. And that information is always, across the board, incomplete. You can't see the whole picture. You can't see what you're deeming a failure in light of the entire happening. What I mean by that is, should you be able to take in the context of the failure at once, with the entire life, with the entire span showing around it? For example, if I may back this up to a near-death experience analogy, the very famed life review that tends to happen within NDEs. It doesn't always. It's a characteristic. Obviously, there's a lot of characteristics that you could look into, but one of them tends to be the life review, in which the subject, in some way, shape, or form, in an instant, is shown the entirety of their life. But even at this point, the entirety of one's life might not be enough. You have to go on a much more universal scale. The entirety of the unfolding of the universe. Were that to be able to be taken in, on the one hand, it would, from a human point of view, from an egoic point of view, nullify this infinitesimal little item that's being deemed as a failure. But even on the grandest scale, you would be able to see that even that tiny, compared to the unfolding of the universe, that tiny little event that's being judged a failure would still be seen to be whole and complete within that magnificent show in that instant. Without seeing the entire picture, without having the complete story, one can't have the ability to wholly critique something as a failure. And yet, our society, our conditioning, our patterns are based solely upon, in many cases, in many items within our lives, upon judgment. And when I say based, I'm saying we base it. It's not the universe that's basing it. The instant of failure comes and goes. The instant that you're deeming a failure comes and goes. It is we who make it last. It is we who attach the importance to it. And it is also we who stretch it out and then project it onto events that may or may not have anything to do with what you're deeming to be your failure. You keep painting that picture. You keep putting the broad strokes of this as a result. This is all happening because of. And yet, if you were to look at it with a far broader perspective and to take yourself out of it, in other words, I know it's hard to do. It's hard to imagine doing that, but it's this is how it works. You would see the impersonal nature of every action and reaction, and you would see ultimately that you had no choice but to do what you are considering to be a failure. You had no choice but to go through this. Those who are around you had no choice but to be complicit, or to even deem it a failure, or to judge. Everything is happening. It is unfolding perfectly. But it's really difficult to tell somebody that when they're in the midst of a trial and they're in the midst of a crisis. The big picture is extremely difficult to see in those moments, in those times. But that doesn't make it any less true. That doesn't make it any less the case. But it also, from the segregated viewpoint, doesn't make it any easier to bear necessarily. So what does one do with failure then? Or what one is considering failure? And how does that relate to inquiry? How does it relate to dismantling? Well, it relates to dismantling in that it is a direct opportunity to challenge and hopefully put to rest once and for all some of your notions dealing with what judgment really means and how judgment really works. How your opinions really work. How your goals, ideas, and dreams really work. Because in light of what we deem a failure, what society deems a failure, what the world deems a failure, when those failures go right up against your dreams, your hopes, your aspirations, it can be an awesome doorway into exploring, well, what brought about those dreams, aspirations, and goals in the first place? Why were they so important? Why was so much energy and value placed on them? To the point where when they didn't happen in exactly the way my mind told me it had to happen for this to be a success, my world seemed to crumble. My identity seemed to crumble. And that's a good one right there. My identity seemed to crumble. What did this supposed failure do to your identity, or to your relationship to your identity? And how can you have a relationship to your identity? Well, that's a great question to ask yourself. It's a great entry to inquiry right then and there. Who failed? How did they fail? Who said they failed? And what evidence ultimately is there that this is a failure? Backed up, as we've already set up, with the big picture, the universal picture that everything unfolds perfectly. If everything unfolds perfectly, as difficult as it is to see when a character is going through what they are deeming a difficult time, as difficult it is to put in that perspective of, and I'm not even trying to make this some Pollyannic, everything happens for a reason, cliched, sweep that under the carpet, but at the same time take the core that's at that cliche. That cliche came from someplace. Those cliches come from someplace. As badly orchestrated or utilized as they might be in trying to give someone comfort in difficult times, they come from someplace. And the core of a cliche is actually a very stark truth. If you pare it down and take the for reason away, you've got everything happens. It's not that everything happens for a reason in that it's to comfort you or to make you move forward or to let this unfold in a way that if I feel there's a meaning to this, I can carry on. The meaning to it is that everything just happens. Now, there's a temptation from a lot of characters to take that nihilistically, but that's actually the greatest news that you could ever receive. Everything happens. Everything unfolds. At each moment that this story is arising in consciousness, you don't have to do any work for it to arise. It's there. It's there. You're not doing anything to make this happen. It's happening. Everything happens. So if everything happens, regardless of what I judge as a great happening for me or what as I judge as a failure for me or for others, ultimately, both of those are happening equally. They are both happenings. Level. The playing field is leveled. The only thing distinguishing what I judge as fantastic and what I judge as a failure is the mind and the judging mechanism upon situations, conditions, and happenings within a storyline that ultimately, as we've already shown, universally, in the big picture, in the grand scheme, are completely whole. We simply cannot have the ability to view that from the partial little slice that you are seeing. And yet, one of the things that inquiry brings about, if brought to its conclusion, is that variability to touch into the wholeness of whatever may be happening. And so this is where failure, what we are deeming failure, can be a fantastic lesson for you in terms of your own inquiry in how, by delving into this and by accepting it and accepting that you don't know what's good for you or you don't know what's bad for you, but just allowing what happens to happen undisturbed, as best as possible, unjudged, and most certainly with a very steely eye towards seeing how you continue to paint what's happening moment by moment by moment under the light of what you might call failure or what someone else might call failure or the after effects of it, when all that's happening is the universe is arising. In terms of a character's storyline, in terms of unfolding, in terms of even realization, you can't see until the bitter end just how what you are deeming as a failure, what you are deeming as a trial, what you are deeming as a horrible situation for yourself or a terrible situation that you're in. You can't see until you're able to look back and connect the dots. How it is those very moments that you're dealing in your mind as failure and you're trying to cope with as a failure, a judged failure. It's those very moments that are opening trapdoors. It's those very moments that are the buoys that when you look back, you'll see, wait a minute. This entire map is on its head. What I was judging as great for me maybe wasn't always so quote-unquote great for me. What I was judging as a failure was actually an opening into seeing what's truly going on. It's tough to do that when you're in the midst of it. It is tough to do when you're in the midst of it. So my suggestion is to just put that kernel back into the back of your mind and understand as best as you can that you're never going to be able to understand certain things about this life. You're never going to be able to understand certain ways and mechanisms in terms of how it happens. And you need to just let your mind chill out a bit as it keeps trying to work and rework and fashion and refashion and tool and retool past, present, and supposed future. Supposed past as well. That's the other thing about failure. In light of judgment, you color all of your memories about certain items in ways that they just aren't. They just aren't. You're making it worse for yourself as a character by letting your mind just pull your attention back and forth over these items, which in the end, I'm telling you, in the end, again, when you look back in broad strokes, you're going to see that those failures go to the top of the heap in terms of if there was to be an importance in life when it comes to inquiry and things being pulled apart so you can see directly what's going on, so you can see directly what's happening, so that regardless if something is judged good or judged bad, the same wholeness is beneath. That same wholeness is beneath. You just can't directly see it yet, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. It's most certainly there. But allowing life to continue to call the shots as it always does. That can be an opportunity to sit back a little bit and let things play their course. They're playing the course anyway, but to let them play their course and to utilize that as fuel for your own discernment. You know, why was this goal so important to me? Why was this relationship so important to me? Why was this item or this trajectory so important to me? If I felt like I couldn't live without it before, and yet now I am living without it, despite the difficulty I'm feeling now, apparently having that item or that goal or that trajectory be there as my mind said it needed to be there wasn't as important, wasn't as necessary, wasn't as vital as the universe, apparently, in the infinite unfolding of this distinct intelligence, needed for it to be within this storyline. And what does that mean? What does that mean about the importance that was put? Where did that importance come from? And these are all buried into our storylines. These are all buried into our personalities and our habits and so on. What was the item? What was the actual impetus that drove me in that direction to keep me from failing, from trying to fail, that stoked my fear of failure, of being in a failing situation, so much that all of my time and all of my energy and all of my aspirations and heartache went into trying to make a certain outcome happen in a certain way. And yet, despite all that time and all that effort, here I find myself. And realizing that what you've deemed a failure is upon you, if you are in a situation that you've deemed a failure, or someone has deemed a failure, or even the world has deemed a failure, believe it or not, if you allow it, it can be extremely freeing. Because what you've seen is that the judging mechanism, both in yourself and in the characters around you, and even the world itself, the socialized world, if you will, is not going to budge an ounce. And even if you had so-called succeeded with whatever that task, whatever that aspiration, whatever that goal had been, there would have still been a reaction of judgment around you and a reaction of judgment in yourself, it wouldn't have been enough. You would have had to keep striving. You would have had to keep going forward to get more and more and more. Why? Because the very thing that you're striving for, the very item that's pushing you along and goading you into feeling as if you are incomplete or there is something that's missing, would never have been fulfilled in the achievement of that goal, would never have been fulfilled in winning, would never have been fulfilled in succeeding. Success might have brought about a temporary relief. For just a moment, the sword, the hammer would have been taken away from your, away from your head. But in very little time, an extremely minute amount of time, if you really look at it, you would see just how quickly that hammer would have been put back over there. And the next goal, the next aspiration, the next thing, a relationship, the next career move would have put itself in your sights. Why? Because your goal, your success, your winning wasn't the answer. It didn't complete the picture in the way that your mind said that it would, that your body felt that it would, that your emotions hoped that it would, and that everything around you, family, friends, society, told you it should. It's amazing too that the setup, if you just, the failure gives you a chance to be able to sit back and really question the setup in a way that you can't unless you're knee deep in what's deemed a failure, because you're able to look around suddenly and say, well, wait a minute, look at the scaffolding. And what I mean by scaffolding is the societal structures, the school structures, the career structures that everybody is continually climbing. And it's almost as if just as they reach the next point, another bit of scaffolding shows up for them to keep trying to climb higher and struggle. That whole scaffolding that's saying this is what you need to do to be happy is covered with people climbing it who are miserable. And yet they continue to climb, and they continue to pull those beneath them up with them, or try to, and they continue to question you or mock you or call you a failure if you start to look at the situation as it is rather than the situation as they're saying it should be. So failure is a springboard. It's a springboard not only into seeing what failure actually is and isn't. It's a springboard into tackling the notion of judgment. It's a springboard into seeing how the universal nature of reality unfolds, and how our minds are set almost dead against taking that reality in as it is, and instead tries to place all sorts of strictures and like constrictions and rules and items that have absolutely nothing to do with the game aside from making sure that the game continues. That's what a judgment truly is. A judgment is you get to it's as if when you get to the end of the Monopoly board, the square, and it's the next dice roll. That's what a judgment is. It keeps you going in the game. It makes sure that you keep going. You keep trying to get more and more and more. The fear of it, the fear of the judgment, the fear of what everybody thinks, but more importantly, the fear that you put into place. That fear that says, I don't want to be judged. I don't want to not live up to what's supposed to be my position in life, the way people will see me. And sometimes it doesn't even come about as sort of a conscious attempt. Sometimes people are just following what I go to school, I get the degree, I get the job, and this is the way it's supposed to unfold. And when it doesn't even fall within the basic structure that's put in, that's looked at by family members or society. Even I'm not. This isn't even necessarily something where someone is hyper vigilantly trying to make these things happen. Sometimes what we deem as a failure can come about by, even in the broadest terms, not having something unfold the way, in the broadest terms, it's thought or expected. I mean, you could have a career, you could have use for your degree. That's a fantastic use. You can have use for your family and with your relationships. It's fantastic. But because it doesn't match what some people think or society might think exactly, or even what your mind says exactly, well, you should be to this point in your career now, or you should be to this point in the relationship now, it's seen as a failure. And that is where the wonderful work of inquiry and pulling this apart can really start to make waves, can really start to get you underneath some of these layers, if you allow it to, if you really start looking. Because the other thing you're not seeing when you're painting that broad stroke of failure over what's arising, over what you're deeming as your past, over what you're thinking is going to be your future, is you're not seeing what's right in front of you, which is all these fantastic opportunities, which is all of these fantastic interactions, which is all of these fantastic abilities to be able to look into your life and to look into the characters around you and the situations around you. But because you don't want to be there, and that's what is happening, you don't want to be where you're at because you don't think you should be there, or someone in your life doesn't think you should be there, or society says that you should be at a different place right now because of where you've been so far on the ladder. And because you're not at that supposed place, you're not seeing all the fantastic things in front of you. So what I say is, take the best of all worlds. Be exactly where you're at, regardless of what everybody says, regardless of what your mind says even. Take in what's exactly in front of you. Take in the people who are there. Take in whatever the activity is that is there, as it is, without labeling, without judgment, and without thinking this is not where I should be right now. And use the moments when those thoughts and feelings arise, that this is not where I should be right now, or moments of judging, or moments of feeling even things such as shame, with all those various emotions and highly, at times, volatile and extremely judgment-tied vibrations. Use those as a moment to flip it on itself and say, all right, where is this coming from? What is wrong with what I'm seeing in front of me, what I'm interacting with in front of me? What's wrong with it? Nothing. Except that my mind, my thoughts, my conditioning, and the conditioning of those around me may be putting an opinion out there that this isn't how it should be. Well, let me give you a little secret. Your mind is always telling you what's in front of you isn't what it should be. So use every opportunity that it does that it says that it puts that notion out there to say why. What do you know? Where does your great advice come from? If I'm a failure having got here by listening to you. And stop listening to it. Or even better, listen to it and see where that's coming from. See where that's arising from. And by doing that, and by really pulling that apart, you're going to see that the web that it's set up for you is extremely thin. It looks like it's thick because everybody's working from the same web, but it's very, very thin. It's so thin that you're going to be amazed as you continue to pull it apart. Amazed how caught you thought you were in it, how much you followed it. The amount of angst that was brought about simply by taking in something that was paper thin and ultimately non-existent. Allow what is deemed as your failure to be the storyline's greatest triumph. And that's where failure becomes that beacon. because the failure is the doorway, not only to getting underneath those layers of ego and those layers of, the layers of thought and the layers of feeling, but failure allows you to get under the entire mechanism. It flips the entire thing on its head, turns the entire world upside down. It is the greatest opportunity that you have in many instances to seeing what's really going on. If you have the eyes to see it, the patience to see it, and the ability to step back enough and not be tricked any longer.